Look closely at the doors of the great cathedrals in Europe, or the towering archways of the US Capitol. They stand nearly 30 feet tall, crafted with a precision that defies the primitive tools of the past. We are told these massive portals were designed for grandeur. But why would a civilization of 5-foot peasants spend decades building entryways meant for beings 3 times their size? What if the tall tales of our ancestors weren't metaphors or myths, but a biological reality? Imagine a humanity with a skeletal density so high it was described as bone-strong as iron. A race of giants that once walked the earth, only to be erased in a global reset between 1850 and 1920. To understand why the giants vanished, we first have to look at the gatekeepers who told us they never existed. If you open the 1771 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, you won't find the world history you were taught in school. On those yellowed pages, Grand Tartary is described not as a wasteland, but as a vast, sovereign empire covering nearly all of northern Asia and much of North America. This is the map that shouldn't exist. According to our modern textbooks, this region was a collection of nomadic tribes and empty steppes. Yet, the old maps show a unified global hegemony, a civilization that shared a singular, massive architectural style. But the mystery of Tartaria isn't just about borders or politics. It is about the people themselves. Ancient folklore from the Americas to the Siberian tundra speaks of a race of first men who possessed immense stature and strength. Researchers suggest that the Tartarians were the biological giants of our past. They weren't just taller, they were the masters of a technology that thrived on the very energy of the atmosphere. A power source that may have dictated their incredible physical scale. Why is this empire missing from our records? The answer is chilling. History isn't just written by the victors, it is rewritten by the survivors of a cataclysm. But history isn't just written by the victors, it's rewritten by the survivors of a cataclysm. Every mystery has its gatekeepers. In the mid-19th century, a new priesthood of science emerged to dictate what was possible and what was myth. Leading the charge were institutions like the Smithsonian in the United States and the Royal Society in London. These weren't just museums, they were the architects of a standardized reality. Think about the year 1859. It is one of the most pivotal dates in human history. This was the year Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. Suddenly, the academic world had a rigid, linear timeline to defend. Every discovery had to fit into a neat progression from primitive ape to modern man. There was no room in this new standard model for a race of giants. If 10-foot humans with iron-like bones were real, then Darwin's entire house of cards would come crashing down. To protect the narrative, the establishment had to perform a massive biological erasure. But they had a problem. The ground was literally spitting up evidence of their lies. Throughout the late 1800s, local American newspapers were flooded with reports of gigantic skeletal remains. From the burial mounds of Ohio to the caves of Nevada, workers were unearthing bones that defied belief. One report from the New York Times in 1897 described a mound in Wisconsin containing a skeleton over 9 feet tall. Another from 1885 detailed bones found in Pennsylvania with double rows of teeth. These weren't just one-off anomalies. These were systemic finds that suggested a massive, non-human or superhuman population once occupied the heartland of America. But as the 19th century drew to a close, a strange pattern emerged. These skeletal finds, which were once treated as major scientific discoveries, suddenly began to vanish. The official story shifted almost overnight. The public was told that these giants were merely pathological anomalies, the result of hormonal diseases like gigantism or acromegaly. But gigantism is a debilitating condition. It makes bones weak, brittle, and prone to deformity. It doesn't produce the bone strong as iron density described by the early excavators. Furthermore, medical gigantism doesn't explain the recurring reports of double dental arches or the strange horn like protrusions mentioned in several Smithsonian field notes. By 1900, the Great Silence had begun. The newspaper reports slowed to a trickle, and the physical evidence was whisked away into government-controlled vaults. Why the sudden cover-up? If these were just medical curiosities, why not display them alongside the dinosaurs? The answer is simple. If the public realized that giants were common, they would start asking who built the massive antique cities that were being discovered across the globe. The establishment claims these finds were hoaxes. But their own internal records tell a different, much more disturbing story. To find the truth, we have to look back, before the modern academic reset. Long before Darwin, scientists were much more honest about what they found in the earth. Take the work of Robert Plot. In 1686, he served as the first keeper of the Ashmolean Museum and published The Natural History of Staffordshire. Plot wasn't a conspiracy theorist, he was a respected scholar. In his book, he meticulously documented a massive femur bone discovered in a local quarry. Based on the proportions of this bone, Plot applied a standard anatomical formula to determine the height of the individual. The calculation was simple but staggering. $text height colors text art femur length times $3.7. The result? A human being standing over 10 feet tall. Modern skeptics claim Plot was looking at the bone of an elephant or a dinosaur. But Plot was an expert in anatomy. He specifically noted the human-like attachment points for muscles that do not exist in pachyderms. This proves that giants were a matter of serious scientific inquiry before the 1850 reset forced everyone to look the other way. But the most damning evidence doesn't come from old books. It comes from the very institution accused of the cover-up. If you dig into the annual reports of the Bureau of Ethnology from the years 1881 to 1894, you find the Smithsonian's own smoking gun. These are official government documents filed by field agents like Cyrus Thomas. In report after report, these agents describe excavating North American mounds and finding skeletons that make modern humans look like children. One report from the 12th annual collection describes a skeleton found in Kanawha County, West Virginia, measuring 7 feet 6 inches tall. Another entry from the 5th annual report mentions a gigantic skeleton with a skull so large it could fit over the head of a normal man like a helmet. These weren't hoaxes written for clicks. They were internal data points meant for the eyes of the establishment. They prove that the Smithsonian knew exactly what was in those mounds. But the evidence isn't just buried in the dirt. It's standing right in front of us in our architecture. Consider the oversized door paradox. In the Hermitage Museum in Russia or the great cathedrals of France, the primary entrances are designed on a scale that is physically irrational for us. We are told these were built for acoustics or spiritual awe. But look at the handles. Look at the hinges. In many of these ancient buildings, you will find the original, massive door handles positioned 7 or 8 feet off the ground, far too high for a 5-foot-tall medieval peasant to reach. Later, smaller human-sized doors were often cut into these massive panels to make them functional for our current, smaller stature. Then there is the sheer scale of the stonework. At the megalithic site of Baalbek, the stone of the pregnant woman weighs an estimated 1,200 tons. In Russia, the megaliths at Mount Shuria feature granite blocks stacked with such precision that not even a razor blade can fit between them, some weighing over 3,000 tons. The official story says these were moved by thousands of slaves using primitive ropes and pulleys. But the physics don't add up. Even with modern cranes, moving a 1,000-ton block is a logistical nightmare. However, if you apply the giant variable, if the builders were 12 feet tall with a bone density and muscle mass exponentially greater than our own, the impossible becomes achievable. What if these structures weren't built by primitive people over centuries, but by a technologically advanced race of giants in a fraction of the time? If these people were real, where did they go? The answer lies in a period of smoke, fire, and mud. If this advanced giant civilization occupied the entire globe, how could they simply vanish? The Tartaria theory suggests that between 1850 and 1920, the world didn't just change, it was reset. The central pillar of this theory is the mud flood. Researchers point to thousands of historic buildings across every continent, from Moscow to New York to Buenos Aires, that share a bizarre feature. They all have half windows or full floors buried deep beneath the current street level. The official explanation is that these were light wells or designed for coal deliveries. But look at the architecture. Why would world-class stonemasons build elaborate arched windows and decorative facades only to bury them 6 feet underground? Proponents believe a mid-19th century cataclysm, possibly involving liquefied soil or a massive environmental upheaval, buried the first floors of the Tartarian world. When the reset began, a smaller modern humanity emerged, or was placed, into these empty mud-caked cities. We didn't build these majestic structures, we simply dug them out and claimed them as our own. This brings us to the most suspicious era in modern history, the age of the Great Fires and the World's Fairs. Between 1870 and 1915, almost every major city on Earth suffered a catastrophic fire. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906, and dozens of others in cities like Seattle, Boston, and Toronto. Was it a coincidence that these fires happened just as the New World Order was being established? Alternative historians argue these weren't accidents, they were tactical cleansings. These fires were used to destroy the bone-strong Tartarian infrastructure that didn't fit the new narrative. Buildings designed for giants, with their 20-foot ceilings and massive entryways, were burned to the ground and replaced with modern structures built to a smaller, more manageable scale. But before the old world was demolished, it was put on display one last time. Enter the era of the World's Fairs. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago is the perfect example. History tells us that a massive, gleaming white city was built from scratch in just 2 years using staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp. We are told this magnificent city, featuring massive domes, electric fountains, and sprawling palaces, was meant to be temporary and was burned down or demolished immediately after the fair. Does that make sense to you? Why spend the equivalent of billions of dollars to build a dream city of fake buildings that look exactly like the stone cathedrals of the old world, only to destroy it 6 months later? Researchers suggest the Chicago World's Fair wasn't a construction at all. It was an existing Tartarian city that had survived the cataclysm. The elite of the late 19th century branded it as a fair to explain its existence to the public. They used it to showcase the technology they were inheriting and then destroyed it to ensure no one could study the truth of its origins. And then there is the energy. Why did the Tartarian giants have bones as strong as iron? Look at the spires and the gold-plated domes of the old world. In the Tartarian narrative, these weren't religious symbols. They were atmospheric energy collectors. Our ancestors lived in a world saturated with free energy, also known as etheric or vril energy. This wasn't just power for lights, it was biological fuel. Science today knows that the environment affects bone density. In a world with higher atmospheric pressure or specialized electromagnetic frequencies, the human body would naturally grow larger and stronger. The iron bone wasn't a mutation. It was the result of living in a high-energy civilization. When the energy collectors were stripped from the tops of our buildings, our environment changed. The free energy was replaced with a metered, wired, and toxic electrical grid. As the energy disappeared, so did the giants. They became smaller, weaker, and more fragile, becoming the modern humans we are today. What happened to the physical evidence of these people during this transition? While the buildings were burned, the bones were gathered and hidden. Think about the massive logistics involved. Millions of orphaned children were moved across the country on orphan trains to repopulate these empty cities. At the same time, specialized teams were reportedly scouring the mounds and the ruins to collect any skeletal remains that proved we weren't the first ones here. This is the black box of history. Everything that happened before the 1850s has been filtered through a lens of primitivism to make us believe we are the most advanced version of humanity to ever exist. But the inheritors, the families and institutions that took control after the reset, knew better. They knew that by controlling the past, they could control the energy, the resources, and the very identity of the human race. The Smithsonian wasn't protecting us from a hoax. They were protecting the new world from the truth of the old one. They were making sure that we never realized we are living in a miniaturized version of a much grander reality. While the buildings were burned, the bones were gathered and hidden. We call this the black box of history. If you think the idea of a massive historical cover-up is impossible, you have to look at how the physical evidence was handled. We have hundreds of accounts of giant skeletons, but almost zero museum displays. Where did they go? The trail leads directly to what researchers call the Smithsonian's black box. Throughout the early 20th century, strange stories began to emerge from the docks of American port cities. There are documented accounts of large, heavy crates being loaded onto government barges under the cover of night. Witnesses claimed these crates contained the anomalous remains found in the mounds of the Midwest. According to some whistleblowers, these barges didn't have a destination. They were taken miles out into the Atlantic, and their contents were dumped into the deep ocean trenches. If the goal was to standardize history, you couldn't just leave a 10-foot femur sitting in a local museum in Ohio. You had to make sure it was gone forever. But the establishment didn't just hide the bones, they rebranded the living. During the late 19th century, a curious phenomenon took over the American public: the traveling circus. Take a second look at the famous circus giants of the Barnum and Bailey era. Men like Captain Martin Van Buren Bates, or the Giant of Illinois, stood nearly 8 feet tall. The official story tells us these individuals were medical freaks or victims of hormonal disorders. But many of them were remarkably well-proportioned, athletic, and possessed incredible strength. Is it possible these weren't accidents of nature, but the last genetic remnants of the Tartarian lineage? By placing these individuals in a circus ring, the establishment achieved a brilliant psychological victory. They took a biological reality and turned it into a sideshow. They made the public laugh at the idea of giants. Once a giant is viewed as a freak or a curiosity, he is no longer a threat to the evolutionary timeline. He becomes a joke, not a piece of history. But who benefits from this massive erasure? Follow the money and the power. By hiding the existence of a giant advanced civilization, the inheritor elite maintained total control over 3 things: history, energy, and medicine. If we knew that we once lived in a world of free atmospheric energy, we would never have accepted the industrial consumerist model. we would never have agreed to pay for electricity or fuel. If we knew that our ancestors had bones strong as iron, we would start asking why our current biology is so fragile. We would question the food, the water, and the very air that has shrunk us down to our current size. This wasn't just about hiding a few big skeletons. This was about hiding a superior way of life. The current power structure relies on us feeling small, both literally and figuratively. They want us to believe we started as primitive hunters and worked our way up to this pinnacle of achievement. But the evidence suggests we didn't climb a ladder. We took a massive step down. This isn't just about the past. The suppression of our true biology has massive implications for our future. Why does this story matter to you today? If the giants were real and their iron bones were a product of their environment, then our current physical state is a choice made by those in power. We are living in an era of the shrinking of humanity. Look around. Modern ceilings are lower. Living spaces are tighter. Our very architecture is being designed to fit a population that is increasingly fragile and easier to manage. If you control a person's history, you control their sense of what is possible. By telling us we were always this small, the establishment ensures we never seek the heights, biological or technological, that our ancestors once reached. But the black box is beginning to crack. For the first time in history, the gatekeepers have lost control of the flow of information. The digital awakening has allowed independent researchers from across the globe to compare notes in real time. A researcher in a small town in Iowa can post a photo of a half-buried brick building and find a near-identical match from a researcher in Vladivostok. We are realizing that the star forts that guard our coastlines and the antique tech spires on our old post offices aren't local accidents. They are the fingerprints of a unified global civilization. Every time you walk through an old downtown area and see those massive, ornate stone buildings that look like they were built for gods, you are seeing the ruins of Tartaria. You are seeing the inheritance that was taken from us. When you look at the tiny modern doors cut into those massive archways, you are looking at a physical representation of our current status. The giants may be gone, but the foundations they built are still beneath our feet. We are finally starting to look down at the mud and realize what we've been standing on this entire time. The question isn't whether giants existed. The question is, what else are they hiding about our true potential? The timeline is clear for those with the eyes to see. In 1771, the world knew of a great Tartary. By 1850, a cataclysmic reset cleared the stage, and by 1920, the history books had been scrubbed clean. We are told we are the peak of human evolution, but the massive doors, the iron-dense bones, and the suppressed maps suggest a different story. We are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are a civilization living in the ruins of giants. We are the inheritors of a world we no longer fully understand. It's time to look up at the doors we can no longer reach and ask, who was here before us? And more importantly, why were we told they never existed? The evidence is all around you, hidden in plain sight within the architecture of your own city. Go outside. Look for the half-buried windows and the red brick foundations that go deep into the earth. Take a photo and share it in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the lost world of Tartaria compelling, hit the like button and subscribe. We are just beginning to scratch the surface of the Great Reset. The truth is heavy, but it's time we start carrying it.